In this video, we're going to begin the assembly of our backpack project. So we are starting with the instructions. Right here under main body, step number 1, take the pocket and bias bind the top edge. Now there's more than one way to do bias binding, but here's how I would like you to do it for this project. So I've got my pocket piece, which is piece number 2, and then my strip of bias binding, which is piece number 9. And if you notice on this pattern, I specifically chose this pattern for this reason. My straight of grain has stripes on it, but these stripes are all going at an angle. So this is on the bias, okay? So here's how we're going to do this. We're going to take your bias piece and your pocket, wrong side facing up so you can see all of your lines, and wrong sides up on your bias binding as well. You're just going to line up the cut edge with the drawn seam line right there, okay? So we're going to line that up right with itself. And it's okay if your bias binding kind of sticks off the edge a little bit, that's okay. It is better for it to stick off a little bit and then we will clip it down later than for it to be too short. Okay. I'm going to pin this in place. Now that I've got it all nicely lined up, cut edge to that drawn line. And you want to be careful when you are using a piece that's bias because it stretches, so you don't want to do any kind of extra pulling with it as you go. All right, so this time for this very first step, we don't actually stitch on a line. What I want you to do is you're going to line the edge of your presser foot with the edge of your bias binding, just like you see right here. Okay, and now we're going to sew all the way down. We're going to stitch these two pieces together. So start off with a back stitch, go all the way down, taking out your pins as you go. I'm going to back stitch again right at the end. And there we go. Clip our threads while we're right here at the machine. Go ahead and clip both sets. That one and these. Remember, I personally cannot stand long tails left on there. Okay, so now these two pieces are attached, and we need to take this to the ironing board for the next step. Now for this step, we need to be at the ironing board, and you're also going to need your scissors, okay? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to take this edge, because it's a little long, and we want to trim it down so that it's about 1/4 of an inch longer than this edge. So kind of basically cut this amount in half. We're going to start by trimming this down. This is called grading, because we're making the seam allowance smaller so that everything fits well inside it. Like that, and then we can dispose of the extra. So now that edge is a little shorter. That's going to make this next part a lot easier. All right, we're done with our scissors. So now what you're going to do is you're going to press your bias binding up and press it with the iron. So we get a nice clean edge that turns up. Now we're going to flip this over. And what you're going to do is you're going to fold the top edge of this bias binding toward this fabric about 1/4 of an inch. You can kind of just eyeball it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just turning the edge under so that in a moment when we flip this over again, we don't have any raw edges at all. That's the whole point of bias binding, is that it takes this cut edge right here and covers it so that it doesn't unravel on you. Okay, so now get that in closer so you can see how I have folded that edge. Now what I'm going to do, get this a little closer to the camera, we're going to fold this over so that this folded edge just barely passes this stitching line. Okay, fold it, and then I'm going to press it in place. So I want to slightly cover that other stitch line. Whoop. Careful when you go backwards because your fabric may move on you. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to take this back to the sewing machine, but before we do, I'm going to go ahead and pin it here at the ironing board. Let me go grab my pins on the other side of the room. Okay, so now we're going to pin this so the bias binding stays in place. There we go. Okay, now let's take this back to the sewing machine. Now we're ready to stitch this edge down. Now this is basically like doing a lapped seam. We're going to stitch right here along the edge of the fabric where it is folded under. We're going to do an edge stitch, which is really close to the edge there. Okay, so we're going to put this under the machine. And I like to, whenever I'm sewing this sort of thing, is I like to find a spot on my presser foot to follow as my guide. So let's see if I can get this in a little closer and point with a needle. So I'm actually, this edge, hard to see, this inside opening on the presser foot, I like to line up the edge of my fabric right here, or if I want to get even closer, there's a little tiny divot right here on the presser foot that I can line up with. I'm actually going to line up there so we get closer to the edge. But that's basically what we're doing. It's just a lap seam. So we're going to start off with a back stitch as always. Take it nice and slow so that it comes out looking great. This particular stitching you're going to see from the outside. Take out my pins as I go. Back stitch again, just like that. And I'm going to clip my tails right here at the machine, both of them. There we go. And now this top edge of the pocket has been bias bound and is not going to unravel. And the way I chose to cut my fabric, I have this lovely accent color on top of my yellow. That's it for the bias binding. Move on to the next video for the next steps of the process. So now we are moving on to step number 2, because we have already taken our pocket and we've bias bound the longer edge here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to lay the pocket onto the front bag piece face up and machine based in seam allowance to keep in place. So here's what that looks like. So first of all, we've got our pocket piece that we just finished working with. And then we've got one of our front or back pieces. This is piece number 1, if you're looking at the numbers. So we're going to lay this so that the right side is facing up. We're going to take our pocket, and with that right side facing up, we're going to stack them on top of each other. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just eyeball lining up these cut edges along the side here. But then I'm going to go through and also with my pins make sure that this is actually lining up pretty close. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect on this step, but we do want it close so that when we sew the sides together, we're catching all of these things together. So what I'm going to do is right here, I'm going to do it from the back side because that'll be a little easier to see. I'm going to put my pin here at the corner and lift up the other layer and make sure that I am also hitting that corner, getting those nicely lined up. Pin in place. Do that here at the other corner. Separate these, make sure they're lining up nice. This part, don't overthink. We just want to make sure that we're close and we're not horribly off, or else it won't work. Okay, we're going to do the same thing right here at the middle. I'm actually going to do this one from the top side because I want to be able to remove this pin while I'm stitching. So I'm hitting the seam allowance on that side, double checking it here, going in and out, just like what we did on our samplers. Okay. Again, we're just making sure that this is close. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect. Okay, so I'm on the seam line there. Match it up on the other side. There we go. Okay. Just like that. And one more side. Yeah. Since I took my time and was especially careful with cutting out all of my pieces and making sure that all of my seam lines are drawn very accurately, this ended up being practically perfect, just lining up the cut edges, and everything fell out perfectly nice. Okay, so now we have laid it onto the front back piece, face up, and now we want to machine baste in the seam allowance. So here's what we're going to do. Pull our machine over. I'm going to adjust the camera so you guys have a better view. Okay, so now we're ready to start stitching in the seam allowance. So to do that, all we want to do is just line up the cut edge with the edge of our presser foot right here, so that when we sew, our stitches will fall between this line and the cut edge, because we don't want them actually on this edge. Okay, you can either do the stitch at a regular stitch length, or you can change the stitch length to the longest it can go. Just remember to turn it back when you're done. I'm just leaving mine at a 3, because why not? It's not going to hurt anything. Pull this pin that's underneath out. All right, I'm going to back stitch here at the end and pull it off. Grab my scissors. But the reason I'm doing this, I sewed all the way to the end and back stitch instead of turning the corner, is because sometimes when you turn the corner on a project like this, that can kind of warp the fabric a little bit, and we want everything to lay nice and smooth and flat together. So basically these 2 layers of fabric live as one piece versus 2 separate pieces. Back stitching and going down the next row. Just running my fabric along the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to take this pin out. And do the last side. Right, and I stopped and started right over the bias binding edge here. Okay, cool. Now that these 2 pieces are together, what we want to do is we want to take this to the iron. So let's go do that real quick. All right, I have trimmed all of my threads, and we've got these 2 layers now stitched together. And we want to press these stitches that we did. Stitching, ooh, goodness, words are apparently difficult this recording. Pressing your seams after you sew does one primary thing. It makes everything really nice and neat, and that's great. But also what it does is it kind of cinches up the stitches a little bit so that they meld into the fabric, and it just makes everything look really nice and pretty and finished. Honestly, the big thing that makes the difference between a professionally looking garment and an amateur made garment is whether or not seams were pressed along in the process. Okay, so now the pocket is attached to the front piece, and we're ready to move on to the next video.